Now, when it comes to the character of Thanos, this is something that I wanted to get off my chest and wanted to talk about for quite a while, as when we were introduced to him formally in Avengers Infinity War, he was supposed to be, or Thanos was marketed as the best or the biggest or baddest MCU villain, whichever way you want to talk about him, which to me didn't actually say a lot because basically all of the MCU villains or all the villains within the Marvel movies are really boring and just plain obstacles for the heroes to overcome. But when I first watched Avengers Infinity War in cinemas, the film was a bit jarring to me to say the least, and it took some time to realize why I felt about it this way. And for me, it has everything to do with the main character of the film, that being Thanos himself, of course. But my first question upon seeing the film itself is, well, why is the quote unquote villain of the story is the main character in an Avengers movie? Like, that to me didn't really make a lot of sense, as of course the character of Thanos was never really actually known to the audience, like his defining character traits or whatever. The only thing that was known about him is that he is supposed to be this big bad villain, or he's supposed to be the be-all end-all of Marvel villains, but he was just teased, never really explored in any further or any other movie in general. Yeah, he had no real character or defining traits leading up to the movie, and therefore I felt like that the writers of the movie really wanted to sell him as this great villain or great character, and they felt like that the movie had to be about him in order for you to care about that character, which they have teased, but they never really gave you anything of that character. It was just a tease for the people who actually know or knew who that character actually was within the comics. And he was built up as this interesting character in the movie, rather conflicted character. Well, my first question when I watched the movie or when I was watching scenes with Thanos is that, why should I care about the villain of the story more than I care about the heroes of the story? Because, when you talk about the character of Thanos, I felt like that the character is interesting in and of itself. The character is conflicted. But when it comes to villains, I think he is not necessarily that he's a bad villain, but I feel like that he's a rather poor villain at that. Is when you really think about his motivation, for example, that doesn't make sense when you think about it for more than 2 seconds at a time. That was the first thing that I kind of gathered from my first viewing of the movie, is that it talks about Earth having finite resources and he's saving humanity, but he doesn't really talk about the fact that humanity has infinite potential when it comes to dealing with these problems. So it really didn't make any sense whatsoever, and it still doesn't make any sense. Those are just big words that you would take away from the movie and thinking, wow, those were, like, he's a really good villain, or he was a really great villain because he had his own motivation, but his motivation doesn't make any sense whatsoever. It never really made any sense. Those are just big words. They are illusions of something bigger than or something more grandeur or more important than actually is. And what I felt like was a really big mistake is that they adapted Thanos' actions from the Infinity Gauntlet story, but they didn't adapt his motivation. Of course, that motivation didn't really fit with it, and I felt like that this was a huge mistake for the character itself, as if you have read Infinity Gauntlet, it does a much better job, not just at presenting to you a compelling character in Thanos, but it also gives Thanos a character arc, where he ends up realizing that he is not worthy of this power in controlling the universe and of the Gauntlet and the Infinity Stones, and therefore he voluntarily exiles himself, or he just decides to live a peaceful life in and of itself. Kind of the same thing happens in Infinity War, but that character arc doesn't really make a lot of sense because it's not really well made, if it makes any sense. Like, it doesn't really fit with the whole story, as I felt like that they just tried to adapt the story beats of Infinity Gauntlet, which of course people know and love, but they failed at the execution or why certain things should happen. They basically failed at the logical conclusions or just building a logical story that would lead to that point of him just giving up that life that he has had before. when we're just talking about like great villains in general, like I felt like that they really wanted this character to live up to Darth Vader, be the next Darth Vader. But when you really think about it, Darth Vader's character was something special in the sense that there wasn't really anything like him back in 1977, right? But as the story went on, his character's background and motivation was fleshed out, and therefore he was an interesting character because he was conflicted. But he still felt like a villain, even though kind of more like at Return of the Jedi. He was rather not necessarily the villain of the story as Emperor Palpatine was, but he was just kind of this conflicted character that was part of the problem, if you will, until he decided not to be part of the problem but be part of the solution. But when we talk about these conflicted villains, of course, we had a lot of two-dimensional villains in not just comic book movies but in general. But there has been a trend kind of ever since like Darth Vader came, and mainly after The Dark Knight hit theaters, that characters or villains kind of have to be these layered and interesting characters in of themselves, which is not a bad thing, mind you. I love interesting and layered characters. But with Thanos, as I mentioned before, I think it just really fell off the wagon, as he's not even a villain of the movie, or you don't feel like that he's a villain, you feel like that he's a savior. And to me, when I think about like great villains, General Zod, for example, from Man of Steel, you understand his motivation and purpose. He only wants to bring back his own people. But you don't feel bad for him in a sense that you would feel for Superman, because as much as you agree or feel his sentiments or understand his purpose of General Zod, you don't agree with the methods that he tried to accomplish his goal. This is what always separates villains from the heroes, is that they might have the same end goal, but the end doesn't justify the means when it comes to the heroes, and with the villains it's usually that the end justify the means. And with General Zod, this is the exact same thing that happened, and the same goes for Steppenwolf from Zack Snyder's Justice League. You understand his motivation. His motivation is to conquer worlds because he wants to go home, because he made a mistake and he wants to atone for his sins. That's kind of the conflict of the character in and of itself. You know, you relate to that. But you don't relate to the fact that he conquers worlds and kills millions of living beings just to get home, so you don't feel bad about when he gets destroyed at the end of the movie. But just jumping back to Thanos. When we are talking about Thanos, I feel like that he is not even a villain in the context of Infinity War. Because I feel like that he's rather presented even as a heroic figure, or to me rather as an anti-hero within the film itself, as the film paints him as this heroic figure saving humanity from itself, even though of course that couldn't really be further from the truth, as he is this sociopathic or psychopathic tyrant when you really think about it. And to me, right off the bat, that was really concerning when I saw the movie, is that they're presenting this highly flawed figure as this heroic messianic savior of the whole universe. And, you know, a lot of young people watch this movie and they don't necessarily understand the meaning behind his actions. They understand that he wants to do good and he destroyed half the universe to do good, and they feel bad for him, or that they feel for him and they understand his motivations. But to me, that just came off as really concerning, that we present something like this as heroic and messianic. When you really think about it, the Avengers should have just opposed this by saying that we understand that you want to save the world, but as much as we have finite resources, humanity has infinite potential when it comes to dealing with these problems. And that should have been the whole crux of the film itself, or the conflict of the film. And I also feel like that this was kind of the corporate attempt, as I mentioned before, to create the next Darth Vader without properly planning out the character's arc from the previous movies, you know, just shoving him into like end credit scenes to tease him, basically to just market the character, even though they never did anything with the character. And as I mentioned before, one saving grace for me would have been that Thanos has this quote-unquote great motivation and grand plan, but the heroes are never really opposed to that ideology. And if one of the movies, either Endgame or Infinity War, had this kind of conflict in it, that the heroes were like, hey, you know, you are wrong because humanity is capable of saving itself, etc., etc., that would have made the movie a lot more interesting for me, in a sense that, well, there is actually a bit of philosophy in there as well, and we have a thesis and an antithesis in that. And there's kind of a discussion in there, but My main takeaway from not necessarily just the whole character, but the whole film itself is that where is the discussion and all that? Is when we're talking about superhero movies in general, of course, they are kind of this dumb popcorn action blockbuster flick movies. But even back in 2016 with Batman v Superman, the whole movie was about the discussion if you really think about it. What is good? Good is not a unilateral decision, it's a conversation. And this movie really didn't capture that for me, or not even the character of Thanos, as he's basically just a tyrant when you really think about it. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you have enjoyed it. If you did so, please leave a like and share all of your thoughts in the comments down below regarding Thanos' character motivation, his role in Infinity War and Endgame, and subscribe for more content like this one, and I'll see you in the next one. And until then, remember to keep it insightful.